I'll never forget that night. It was supposed to be a simple drive, just me, the road, and my thoughts. I was heading back from a work conference that had run longer than expected. It was already past 10 at night when I decided to take the road. The GPS showed the fastest route was a rural road I didn't know well, but anxious to get home, I took the chance. The road was narrow and winding, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to reach the sky. Darkness swallowed the landscape, and my car's headlights were the only source of light. I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles, and the radio was just static. I tried calling my wife to let her know I'd be late, but there was no cell signal. An eerie silence filled the air, broken only by the engine's hum. As I continued, I noticed that the road felt more and more remote. The trees formed strange shadows, and I thought I saw quick movements between them. It's just my imagination, I told myself, trying to focus on driving. But the feeling that something was off only grew stronger. About an hour into the drive, the car started to sputter. I glanced at the dashboard, but no warning lights were on. Maybe it's just a bumpy road, I reassured myself. But the jolts grew worse, and the car started losing power. I slowed down, worried I might end up stranded in the middle of nowhere. I decided to pull over and check things out. As I stepped out, a chilly wind cut right through me. I opened the hood and tried to spot any obvious issues, though I wasn't exactly mechanically inclined. Everything looked fine at first glance. That's when I heard a faint sound, like a whisper coming from the forest. I looked around, but there was only darkness and the trees swaying in the wind. I got back into the car, determined to keep going. I turned the key and the engine started, but something was wrong. The GPS screen began to flicker, showing strange, incoherent directions. I figured I'd keep driving and eventually come across a gas station or a town. A few minutes later, I saw a sign up ahead. I drove closer to read it, but the letters were faded and illegible, except for an arrow pointing straight ahead. I kept going, but the road seemed endless. There were no turns, no exits, just a single, unchanging path. That feeling of being watched crept up on me again. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a shadow on the road behind me. A dark figure vanished the second I tried to focus on it. A chill ran down my spine. I tried turning on the radio, hoping to catch a station that could keep me company, but it was all static and strange noises. Suddenly, a distorted voice broke through the static, saying words I couldn't make out. I turned off the radio, disturbed. The situation worsened when the headlights started to flicker, casting my surroundings into darkness before flashing back on. The engine began to choke, and before I could do anything, the car stopped entirely. I tried starting it several times, but it was no use. I was stranded on a deserted road with no cell signal and no signs of life around. I took a deep breath, trying not to panic. I remembered I had a flashlight in the glove compartment. I grabbed it and got out of the car to assess the situation. The silence was oppressive. Even the wind seemed to have died down. Darkness surrounded me, and the flashlight barely cut through it. I decided to walk a bit ahead, hoping to find some sign of civilization. A few yards down the road, I spotted something on the shoulder. As I got closer, I realized it was an abandoned car, covered in dust and leaves, as if it had been there a long time. I peeked through the dirty windows, but saw no one. The interior was empty, save for scattered personal items, a purse, a coat, a torn map. A sense of unease washed over me. Why would someone abandon a car out here in the middle of nowhere? Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, like branches snapping underfoot. I spun around, aiming the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. The forest was still. I hurried back to my car, eager to get away. When I tried the ignition, the car surprisingly started. Relieved, I prepared to leave. But then I noticed the dashboard clock read 3:33 a.m. I glanced at my watch, which showed 1:15. How could that much time have passed? I ignored the discrepancy, blaming it on some glitch in the car. I accelerated, wanting only to leave that road behind. As I drove, I saw lights in the distance. Finally, signs of life, I thought. But as I approached, I realized it was the same abandoned gas station I'd passed hours earlier. How was that possible? I had driven in a straight line the entire time. I parked at the station, hoping to find someone who could help. The lights were on, but the place was empty. The door was slightly open, so I went in. Inside, everything was dusty, as if no one had been there for years. The shelves were bare, and silence filled the air. At the counter, I found an old phone. I picked it up and, to my surprise, there was a dial tone. I called emergency services and tried to explain my situation calmly. The operator said they'd send someone, but the call abruptly cut out before I could give my exact location. I returned to the car, hoping help would arrive soon. Minutes felt like hours. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw headlights approaching. A mix of relief and apprehension washed over me. The vehicle stopped beside mine, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a friendly expression, asked if I needed help. I quickly explained what had happened, and he offered to give me a ride to the nearest town. I looked at my car, hesitant to leave it, but decided to accept. On the way, I told him about the strange events of the night. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he said something that stuck with me. "You're not the first person to go through this on that road," he said, with a serious tone. "There are stories about that place. People disappearing, time going missing. It's why I avoid driving there at night." We reached the town, and he dropped me off at a hotel. I thanked him, and we said goodbye. The next day, I returned with a tow truck to retrieve my car, but when we reached the spot, it was gone. The gas station looked different too, as if it had aged overnight. Confused, I spoke to the authorities, but they found no record of my emergency call in that area. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. The memories haunt me, and I avoid driving on deserted roads after dark. There was something unnatural about that road, and I feel like I left a part of myself there. I may never uncover the truth, but one thing is certain: some paths are best left unexplored, especially when the darkness holds more than we can imagine. Story 2. It was a dark and rainy night, the kind where the downpour feels endless, and the road turns into a long sheet of water. I'd spent the entire day at a business meeting in the neighboring city and was anxious to get home. The highway was practically deserted, and visibility was minimal due to the heavy rain. The wipers worked at full speed, barely managing to keep the windshield clear. The road twisted through open fields, and there were no streetlights along that stretch. Only my headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road a few yards ahead. Inside the car, the silence was broken only by the steady patter of rain and the sound of tires on wet asphalt. To stay alert, I turned on the radio, but only static came through, along with some faint music interspersed with interference. I decided to turn it off and focus on driving. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, I saw a figure up ahead on the shoulder of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a man, completely drenched, waving desperately. He wore a dark coat, which looked heavy with rain. My first instinct was to keep going. After all, it was late, and picking up strangers wasn't something I typically did. But something about his frantic gestures struck me. I thought he might be in serious trouble. I slowed down and stopped a few yards ahead of him. Looking in the rearview mirror, I saw him running toward the car. I unlocked the passenger door, and he quickly climbed in, bringing a gust of cold, damp air with him. "Thank you," he said, breathless. I thought no one would stop. "No problem," I replied, trying to sound calm. "This rain is something else. Where are you headed?" He looked at me for a moment before answering, "Just keep going straight. I'll tell you where to drop me off." I nodded, though his vague answer made me uneasy. I started driving again, and for a few minutes, silence filled the car. I stole glances at him. He looked to be about 40, with dark, messy hair and deep-set eyes that carried a hint of sadness. His clothes were worn, and he held a small, battered backpack. "Have you been waiting long for a ride?" I asked, trying to break the ice. "Long enough," he answered without taking his eyes off the road. "These roads can be very lonely at night." "That's true," I agreed. "I don't usually take this route, but today I thought I'd switch things up." He gave a faint smile. "Sometimes, different paths lead to unexpected places." Something about his manner intrigued me. His voice was calm, but carried an air of mystery. I decided not to prolong the conversation and focused on driving. The rain kept pouring, and the road seemed endless. After a few minutes, he broke the silence. "Do you believe in destiny?" he asked, turning to look at me. The question caught me off guard. "I'm not sure," I replied hesitantly. "I think some things happen by chance, and maybe others don't." Interesting, he said, turning his gaze back to the road. I believe certain people are meant to meet, even if only for brief moments. I offered a half-hearted smile. Maybe you're right. He then started talking about life, asking personal questions that made me uncomfortable. Do you have a family? He asked. Yes, I'm married and have a young daughter, I replied, trying to be polite. It must be nice to have someone waiting for you at home, he said with a melancholic tone. It is. And you? Do you have family? He stayed silent for a few moments before answering. I did, but things don't always go as we plan. His response deepened my unease. I decided to change the subject. Do you know if there's a gas station or cafe nearby? Maybe we could stop and grab some coffee. He looked at me again, his gaze intense. There's nothing around here for miles. This road is known for being isolated. I nodded, feeling a chill creep up my spine. The atmosphere in the car was becoming increasingly strange. Silence returned, and I could feel his occasional glances at me. Suddenly, he began to tell a story. A few years ago, there was an accident on this road, he said in a low voice. A family was returning from a trip. The rain was heavy like tonight. Their car skidded and veered off the road. My heart started to race. Really? I hadn't heard about that. It happened a long time ago, he continued. The driver didn't survive. They say he was rushing to get home. He'd promised to be there for his daughter's birthday. A wave of discomfort washed over me. The story sounded eerily familiar. That's tragic, I managed, trying to keep my composure. Yes, he agreed. The man's wife and daughter waited for him that night, but he never arrived. Since then, some say his soul still travels this road, trying to make it home. I swallowed hard. This was getting too unsettling. Creepy story for a night like this, I said, forcing a laugh. He turned to look at me again. Have you ever lost someone close? He asked, his gaze piercing. I've lost a few relatives over the years, I replied, unwilling to go into detail. I see. Loss can be hard to overcome. The tension in the car was unbearable. I decided it was time to end this ride. Look, I think there's an intersection coming up. It might be a good spot for you to get off. He didn't answer immediately. He just stared ahead. Finally, he said, You seem like a good man. Take good care of your family. Thank you, I replied, puzzled by his sudden change of tone. Then he said something that sent chills down my spine. Little Anna must be big now, isn't she? I froze. How did he know my daughter's name? I hadn't mentioned it. How? How do you know my daughter's name? I asked, trying to keep calm. He looked me right in the eyes. I know a lot about you. Fear surged through me as my mind searched for an explanation. Maybe he recognized me from somewhere, or he was a distant acquaintance. Have we met before? I asked, my voice trembling. In a way, yes, he replied cryptically, but not in the way you think. I pressed the gas pedal, desperate to reach any sign of civilization. The rain poured harder, and the road remained deserted. Stop the car, he said suddenly. What? Stop the car now, he repeated firmly. Without thinking, I pulled over. My heart pounded in my chest. Look, I don't know who you are, but I think it's time for you to get out. He smiled, a smile devoid of warmth. You finally understand. Understand what? I asked, feeling the panic rise. That you shouldn't have stopped for me, that some things should remain in the past. I don't know what you're talking about, I exclaimed. He sighed. You were there that night. You were responsible for the accident. I felt a lump in my throat as long-buried memories surfaced. Years ago, on a rainy night, I'd been involved in an accident on this very road. I'd overtaken a car at high speed and it had lost control. But I never stopped to help. Guilt had haunted me since, but I'd buried that memory deep. This can't be, I whispered. Oh, it can, he said, his eyes fixed on me. My wife and daughter never understood why I didn't come home. Tears started streaming down my face. I'm sorry. I was young and reckless. I didn't know what to do. It's too late, he said, but maybe you can find redemption. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by guilt. When I opened them again, he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if he'd never been there. I looked around, but there was nothing but rain and darkness. Shaken, I started driving again. Eventually, the rain eased and city lights appeared on the horizon. I got home still in shock. My wife noticed something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her. In the days that followed, I searched for records of the accident. I found an old article about a fatal crash involving a man named Thomas, whose family never learned the full story. I decided to find his family. I met his widow, now elderly, and confessed everything. I asked for forgiveness, knowing it might not be enough. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "At last, the truth is out. Now we can have peace." Since then, I've carried that night's memory as a reminder of my mistakes. I don't know if the man I saw was a ghost, a manifestation of my conscience, or something beyond comprehension, but he gave me a chance to do the right thing, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Story 3. I never imagined a simple weekend trip could change my life so profoundly. It was supposed to be just a getaway with friends, something to relax before returning to the stress of work. My 3 friends, Ethan, Alex, and Sarah, and I rented a house in a mountainous area known for its stunning landscapes and starry skies. We had no idea that trip would give us something we'd never forget. After 2 wonderful days of hiking, bonfires, and laughter, it was time to go home. We decided to leave late on Sunday to avoid the next morning's traffic. The sky was clear and the setting sun bathed the horizon in shades of orange and pink. We said goodbye to the caretaker, packed up the car, and began our descent along the winding mountain road. I was driving, with Ethan in the passenger seat. Alex and Sarah sat in the back, laughing over some inside joke. Soft music played on the radio, creating a relaxed vibe. The road was empty, and the only light came from our headlights and the emerging stars. As we continued, dusk gave way to night. The stars shone brilliantly, unspoiled by city lights. Sarah, always fascinated by astronomy, pointed out constellations through the window. "Look, there's Orion," she exclaimed. Alex tried impressing her with random facts about shooting stars, and we all laughed at his attempts. Then Ethan got our attention. "Hey, do you guys see that?" he asked, pointing to the horizon ahead. A bright, intense light hovered in the sky, just above the mountains. At first, I thought it was an airplane, but it wasn't blinking like airplane lights should, and it moved erratically. Left, right, sometimes just floating. "Probably a drone," Alex suggested, though he looked intrigued too. Sarah frowned. "A drone that high and far away? Doesn't make sense." We kept watching as the light seemed to follow us, maintaining a constant distance. An uneasy silence settled in the car. I tried brushing it off. "It's probably a satellite or a weather balloon. Nothing to worry about." But inwardly, I was also unsettled. The light was unlike anything I'd seen. We decided to ignore it and continued our conversation, but the mood had changed. A few miles later, the light grew brighter and seemed closer. "This is getting weird," Ethan said quietly. "It's getting closer." Sarah suggested we pull over to get a better look. Reluctantly, I pulled off to the side. We all got out of the car, the mountain air chilly against our skin. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the faint sounds of some nocturnal animal. We stared at the sky, and there it was, the light, hovering. Suddenly it started moving toward us. "Get back in the car," I shouted, panic setting in. We scrambled back inside, slamming the doors. I hit the gas, trying to put distance between us and that light. My heart was pounding, and my hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. "What was that?" Alex asked, his voice shaky. No one had an answer. The radio crackled with static, interrupting the music. I tried switching stations, but everyone was the same, static. I turned it off, and silence filled the car. The light reappeared, this time beside the road, matching our speed. Fear gripped us. Sarah began crying softly, and Alex tried to comfort her. Ethan watched the light, transfixed, trying to understand. Without warning, the car's electronics started failing. The headlights flickered, the dashboard turned on and off, and the engine began to stutter. "This can't be happening," I muttered, struggling to stay calm. The car lost power and stalled in the middle of the road. I tried the ignition repeatedly, but nothing happened. "We're in the middle of nowhere," Alex exclaimed. "Now what?" I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. The others checked their phones, with the same result. We were completely isolated. Suddenly, a blinding light surrounded us, like a spotlight from the sky. It was so bright we had to close our eyes. A piercing, almost deafening sound vibrated in our ears. I felt a wave of dizziness, and everything went dark. When I came to, I was back in the car. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The high-pitched sound was gone, and the intense light had vanished. I looked around and saw my friends waking up, looking dazed. "What happened?" Sarah asked weakly. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It read 3:33 a.m. This doesn't make sense, Ethan said. The last time I checked, it was just past 10 p.m. We'd lost hours with no explanation. The car's engine worked fine and the electronics seemed normal. We decided to keep driving, eager to reach somewhere populated. I drove in silence while everyone tried to process what had happened. None of us had answers, only questions. When we finally reached the next town, we stopped at a 24-hour gas station. The attendant looked at us strangely. "You guys okay?" he asked. We must have looked terrible. "Yeah, just need to use the bathroom and grab something to eat," I replied. As the others went to the restroom, I stayed at the counter. The attendant kept watching me. "Did you come from that road?" he asked, pointing in the direction we'd come from. "Yes," I said, hesitantly. "Why?" He shook his head. "People avoid that road at night. They say strange things happen." I felt a chill. Like what? "People talk about lights in the sky, lost time, stuff like that, but it's probably just stories," he said with a shrug. My friends came back, and we got in the car to continue. As we drove, I shared what the attendant had told me. "So we're not the only ones," Sarah said, trying to find some comfort in that thought. In the days that followed, we each tried returning to our routines, but something had changed. We started having strange dreams, vivid nightmares that felt real. We'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with images we couldn't explain. A week later, I noticed a strange mark on my arm. It was a small, circular scar that I didn't remember getting. I called Ethan, and he said he had a similar mark. Alex and Sarah confirmed the same. Something had happened that night, something beyond our understanding. We decided to meet up and discuss it. Gathered at Sarah's house, we shared our experiences. The dreams, the marks, the constant feeling of being watched. We realized we couldn't ignore what had happened. Ethan suggested we see a hypnotherapist to help us remember what happened during those lost hours. Reluctantly, but with no other options, we agreed. In the hypnosis sessions, disturbing details emerged. We described bright rooms, tall, slender beings, and medical procedures. The sensation of being trapped, unable to move. It was too terrifying to believe, yet we all shared the same memories. We joined forums and groups that discussed similar phenomena and met others who had gone through similar experiences in the same region. Piecing it all together, we started to accept that maybe we'd been abducted. Over time, we learned to live with the experience. The marks on our bodies remained, but the dreams became less frequent. We decided to turn our story into a warning for others, sharing what we'd been through. We never went back to that road, and we avoided night drives through isolated areas. Life went on, but the certainty that we aren't alone in the universe stayed with us forever.